Thanks. Well, let me start with last fall, last September, fall 2002. September was a very important moment in world affairs and world history, in fact. Last September, the most powerful state in history declared its intention to maintain its domination of the world by force, the dimension in which it does reign supreme, and it made it clear that it would use this force not only to control the world, but to destroy any potential challenge that it sensed to trying to equal or oppose this force. There wasn't any mistaking the intended message. It was clear, frank, honest, and it was understood right in the heart of the establishment, in fact. So the main establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, in its next issue had an article by a well-known international relations specialist, John Eikenberry, who described it in words so clear and accurate that I'll just quote him instead of giving my own. He said that the United States had announced a grand strategy that begins with a fundamental commitment to maintaining a unipolar world in which the United States has no peer competitor, a condition that is to be permanent so that no state or coalition will ever challenge the United States as global leader, protector, and enforcer. The position renders international norms of self-defense enshrined by Article 51 of the UN Charter almost meaningless. In general, the stance dismisses international law and institutions as of little value. He says, if you read the document as you should, you'll notice that there's barely a mention of either the United Nations or international law. Going on with Eikenberry, the new imperial grand strategy presents the United States as a revisionist state seeking to parlay its momentary advantages into a world order in which it runs the show. It will prompt others to find ways to work around, undermine, contain, and retaliate against U.S. power. The strategy may appear successful in the short term, but, he goes on, it threatens to leave the world more dangerous and divided, and the United States less secure. It's a view which is, in fact, widely shared right within the foreign policy elite, not to speak of overseas, where George Bush has indeed succeeded in granting Osama bin Laden the wish beyond his wildest dreams, I imagine. He's turned the United States into the most feared and disliked and in many quarters hated country in the world. The rhetorical radicalism of this imperial grand strategy is highlighted when you contrast it with the conception of world order that's sustained by the International Court of Justice, the World Court. That was reiterated shortly before the strategy was announced by its president, who happens to be a U.S. judge, conservative U.S. Judge Schwebel. He's long been a lone defender of U.S. policies at the court. He was presenting the annual ICJ report to the United Nations. He informed the General Assembly that as the court enters the first century of the third millennium, it stands for international law, not international lawlessness, for the peaceful settlement of international disputes in conformity with international law, not the will of the more powerful party, for international organization, not for international anarchy, nor for a state sovereignty which purports to be above the law. It stands for human rights, rights that can be effectively realized only within functioning systems of law, local, national, and international. Exactly what is to be torn apart by the imperial grand strategy. Hard to find a more dramatic antithesis than this statement by a conservative U.S. justice and the administration of his country, and it sent plenty of shudders around the world, including, as I mentioned, U.S. foreign policy elites. If you read about it, it's often called a new doctrine of preemptive war. That's not really accurate. The term preemptive war actually has a meaning. Preemptive war means which could fall within the range of Article 51 of the UN Charter. That's the article which grants the unique right of use of force in self-defense against armed attack. Preemptive war would be a war against ongoing or imminent attack when no other means are available. So, for example, you may recall that 20 years ago, another cowboy leader over in the White House warned us that we were about to be attacked from an air base in the dangerous state of Grenada, where the Russians were going to use it to, assuming they could find it on a map, they were going to use the air base to bomb us. Okay, suppose that fantasy was real. It led to a U.S. invasion, after which the U.S. was standing tall once again for saving us from this threat. But suppose it were true, and the Russians were bombing us from Grenada, and the planes were in the air, and they were plainly heading to Washington to bomb the White House. Then it would be legitimate under the doctrine of preemptive war for the U.S. Air Force to shoot them down before they actually did the bombing, and maybe even to attack the air base in Grenada. That would be preemptive war. But that's not what's proposed. What's proposed is sometimes more accurately called preventive war. So in the technical literature, it's pointed out, preventive, not preemptive, means you're going to prevent any potential challenge. However, even that is much too generous. There's nothing to be prevented. So the invasion of Iraq wasn't intended to prevent anything, and the doctrine makes clear that what's going to be prevented is any challenge that the U.S. government decides is a potential challenge. Well, that's a doctrine of prevention which calls for Nuremberg trials. At the outset, the explanation was that preventive war would be against any country that's threatening to develop weapons of mass destruction, which could ultimately threaten us. After the fiasco about finding weapons of mass destruction, that was modified, and the latest version that's been pronounced by a high official is that the U.S. is entitled to carry out preventive war against any country that has the ability and intent to produce weapons of mass destruction. Well, just about anybody has the ability, including the local high school here, if it has a chemistry and biology lab. And intent is, you decide when there's an intent. So that essentially means we'll attack anybody we like. We decide they have the intent, they always have the ability, so it's fair game. The imperial grand strategy that was announced is a doctrine. When you announce a doctrine, you have to get people to take it seriously. It has to be converted into what respected, it's okay if I criticize lawyers, what respected legal commentators will call a new norm in international affairs. And in order to establish a new norm in international affairs, the doctrine has to be implemented. So therefore, Washington needed a test case to implement the new doctrine and establish it as a norm, what the New York Times, after the event, called a petri dish test case, where you try it out and make people know that you mean it seriously. The target for preventive war has to meet a number of conditions. First crucial condition, and this is worth keeping in mind for predicting the future of the doctrine, the first crucial condition it has to meet is that the country has to be completely defenseless, kind of like Grenada. Otherwise it's not a good idea to get involved in a conflict. The That requires a huge propaganda campaign, like in the case of Grenada, to build it up as an awesome threat, but then you miraculously succeed in overcoming it. But you have to understand that it's defenseless. The second crucial condition it has to meet is that the country has to be important enough to be worth conquering. So there's no point conquering some country in Africa that nobody ever heard of. The third point, the third condition, is that it has to be evil. So when you put together the three conditions: defenseless, important, evil, that spells Iraq. The first two conditions are obvious. It's obviously defenseless. It's enormously important, right in the heart of the world's energy-producing regions, second largest resources in the world. As to the evil, that's easy too. You just have to repeat the standard Bush and Blair and Powell rhetoric, which is all accurate except hypocritical. You have to repeat the mock horror about a man who's so evil that he would even use gas against his own people. Heard this hundreds of times, always omitting the crucial words, with our help, because we didn't care. You also have to express more mock horror about the, in fact, horrible mass graves that are being exposed every day from Saddam's vicious repression of the 1991 uprising that might well have overthrown him, again omitting the crucial words, with our help, for reasons that were in fact clearly explained right in the mainstream press. When the U.S. turned down requests from rebelling Iraqi generals to have access to captured Iraqi equipment and authorized Saddam Hussein to use the military helicopters and other heavy weapons that were of which you can now see the effects. It was known then, but now it's graphically explained. It was explained in the press. We didn't like it, but it had to be done for higher reasons of state to maintain what was called stability. The chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, essentially giving the State Department position, explained that we just had to do it. He said the best of all worlds for Washington would be an iron-fisted military junta ruling Iraq the same way that Saddam did, but with a different name, because his name was now embarrassing. We supported him all along, but can't do it anymore, so we need another Iraqi military junta, but somebody else. And since we haven't been able to find anyone else, we'll settle for Saddam Hussein, second best, but definitely not leave Iraq in the hands of its own people, which would have been the very likely outcome of the uprisings had the United States, which is of course in total control of the air and the ground at the time, if it hadn't essentially authorized the slaughters whose effects, grisly effects, are now being deplored. Well, that worked, and there is a guiding principle that remains. If you take a look at all the meandering of U.S. policy with regard to Iraq over the last years, there is one fixed principle. Iraq cannot be ruled by its own people. That proceeds. Just 2 days ago, leading Shiite cleric who was speaking to a huge crowd in the what's now been renamed the Sadr City slum in Baghdad, appealed to what he called people of humanity in the United States to oppose the U.S. military occupation and leave Iraq to its own people. And again, with all the meandering of policy, that principle has remained. Rejection of that option remains a constant, invariant principle, and it follows from the second of the three conditions. Iraq is just too important to be left to its own people. We've got to run it. Well, in any event, Iraq met all three conditions. The new norm of preventive war is therefore established. Legal scholars can now explain learnedly that law is a flexible living instrument with norms established by practice and so on. Again, there's a few words omitted. The norms are established by the practice of the most powerful state, nobody else. If others commit what was called at Nuremberg the supreme crime, namely the one that was just reenacted in Iraq, if others carry that out, or even lesser crimes, they don't establish new norms. In fact, they have to be severely punished. But when the most powerful state does it, that's a new norm, got a precedent, doctrine's fixed. Okay, back to September. One crucial event in September was the pronouncement of the new doctrine, and a second was the beginning of the massive propaganda effort to build up some degree of popular support for the planned implementation of the doctrine, the Petri dish. That's September's when the drumbeat of propaganda began about how Iraq was an imminent threat to U.S. national security. There were also insinuations about Iraq's responsibility for 9/11, about its links with al-Qaeda, its man's a terrorist, and so on. And that had a very quick effect. Within a few weeks, Congress passed a resolution granting the executive the right to use force at the White House's choice because of the threat to the national security of the United States. Those of you who, with a good memory, may recall that in 1985, the previous cowboy leader declared a state of national emergency in the United States because of the threat to the national security of the United States posed by the government of Nicaragua. That was after the threat from Grenada had been thankfully beaten back. But the Nicaraguans were only 2 days driving time from Harlingen, Texas. They're waving their copies of Mein Kampf, as the Secretary of State George Schultz put it, just about to destroy us, but as Reagan courageously announced, despite the odds, he's not going to be afraid. He's going to continue fighting, recalling Winston Churchill, which you're supposed to do in those circumstances. And we had a state of national emergency redeclared annually and redeclared again by Congress last October, this time with regard to Iraq, not Nicaragua. That had an instant effect. There was a huge government media propaganda campaign. By the end of September, polls registered that about 60% of the population thought that Iraq was an imminent threat to the security of the United States. Similar percentages quickly came to believe that Iraq was involved in, maybe even responsible for the September 11th attacks, and that it was linked to terror and planning new ones and so on. Those opinions were, as you'd expect, closely correlated with support for war. And that makes a lot of sense. If you believe that Iraq is a major threat to, an imminent threat to our security, that it carried out the September 11th bombings, planning new ones, then it makes sense to prevent the next attack before it's too late. So correlation is not surprising. There was the carefully stage-managed speech, victory speech on the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier. Was announced, Bush announced a victory over terror because of Iraq's links to al-Qaeda. All of this is known to be complete fabrication, but it's quite effective. He could make that speech without fear that the headlines were going to say you're lying, and you know perfectly well there's no connection to al-Qaeda. One well-known commentator, senior associate of the Carnegie Foundation, Anatol Levin, describes this government media propaganda campaign. He says, for systematic mendacity, it has few parallels in peacetime democracies. And that's not entirely false, though. If you go back to the first tenure in office of the same people. It's mostly recycled Reaganites. There are plenty of similar examples, and unfortunately plenty in between too. It was effective. The U.S. is unique in the world in having regarded Iraq as a threat to its security. Saddam Hussein was despised everywhere, quite rightly, but not feared. The countries of the region, which had every reason to fear him, didn't fear him. In fact, they'd been working for a number of years to try to reintegrate Iraq back into the regional system and maybe hope for some internal overthrow, which could have happened. Kuwait and Iran, two countries which Saddam Hussein invaded, they of course despise him, but they didn't fear him. And they didn't fear him for perfectly obvious reasons, perfectly well known to U.S. intelligence. Iraq was the weakest state in the region by a long shot. Its economy and its military expenditures were about a third those of Kuwait, which has 10% of its population, much less than other regional countries, far below the regional superpower, the U.S. offshore military base in Israel, which completely dominates the region militarily. But even next to the neighbors, it was essentially nothing. It's the first condition for the Petri dish. There was a relationship to Al-Qaeda. The relation is that recruitment for Al-Qaeda and similar networks shot up during the build-up to the war, and since then, exactly as had been predicted by intelligence agencies and independent strategic analysts, and for very obvious reasons. It's been understood that measures like this and threats like this will lead to proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and terror, if only partly for revenge, but if only for deterrence. That's well understood. Well, another event last September, critical event, was that September was the opening of the midterm election campaign. The most important person in Washington, Karl Rove, Republican campaign manager, had explained to Republican activists over the summer, in fact, that they had better make sure not to go into the election campaign allowing domestic issues to have any prominence, because they'll get smashed on that for obvious reasons. They have to switch the focus of the campaign to national security. That way, maybe people will hide under the umbrella of power and forget the fact that they don't have a pension and Kenneth Lay is walking away with their money and so on and so forth. And that was done. For the next presidential campaign coming up, Rove has already stated the obvious. It's nice that he says it. You can quote him. It's obvious even if he doesn't say it. Namely, that they're going to have to do the same thing for the presidential campaign for even more striking reasons. The Wall Street Journal correctly pointed out that the extravaganza on the Abraham Lincoln was the opening shot in the presidential campaign. It wasn't a victory speech. There's no victory, but it was the presentation of the powerful wartime leader who will protect us from the next dragon he'll be about to slay by then. The campaign, just by sheer accident, is beginning in New York City on September 11th. It's delayed to have the right date, and the core issue will be defending us from an imminent threat to existence. Crucially, don't pay any attention to that $44 trillion deficit that was calculated by government economists, but kept out of the federal budget message to Congress a couple of months ago, so as to expedite passage of another tax cut for the rich. The purpose, as a number of mainstream top economists have pointed out, and is obvious again, is to yield what they call a fiscal train wreck, the purpose of which is to destroy social spending. So you can't go into an election saying we're going to wipe out any social spending that might help people. But you can say, we've got a fiscal disaster, so therefore what can we do? I got to destroy everything. In fact, it was conceded by White House spokesperson Ari Fleischer a couple of days ago in a press conference here. He was asked about the $44 trillion deficit, and he said, yeah, it's accurate. He said, then here's what he said. He said, there is no question that Social Security and Medicare are going to present future generations with a crushing debt burden unless policymakers work seriously to reform those programs. Well, reform doesn't mean fund them with progressive taxation. What it means is dismantle them by various devious means. One is to transfer them over to the states, which have a crushing fiscal burden as well. And all of this is really important. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, schools, these all have very serious defects. They're based on a principle that is evil, as George Bush hears from his direct line to God. They're based on the principle. They're based on the principle of sympathy, the principle that Adam Smith and David Hume and other dangerous radicals described as the core of human nature. And that's correct. All of these institutions are based on the idea that you should care if the disabled widow across town can survive another day, or if the kid across the street can get a decent education. And that's evil. You're not supposed to believe that. Evil doctrines have to be driven from the mind, as Ashcroft and Bennett and other moral authorities can explain. And that means you got to eliminate the institutions. If you can only do it by a fiscal train wreck, do it that way. Actually, there are other advantages, many others, but one is that, say, privatization of Social Security, so you say privatization of pensions, that has the great positive element of compelling working people to be actively committed day by day against their own interests. So if your pension depends on the profits of the company you're working for or whoever else you've invested in stocks, you must oppose decent wages, safety standards in the workplace, labor rights. You got to oppose all those things because otherwise you won't have a pension. You have to make sure that the rich are happy, because if they're happy, maybe they'll be nice to you, just as in the feudal system, which they're effectively trying to restore. Sometimes a number of commentators have pointed out that the focus on national security and Iraq and all this business was done for short-term political advantage. But that understates the point. This is very serious. Maintaining a very thin hold on power is a very high priority. A couple more years in power, they may be able to institutionalize the extremely regressive programs that will seriously undermine human rights, civil liberties, create a kind of utopia of the masters. And the only way to maintain that thin hold on power is to inspire fear, exactly as Karl Rove explained. And worth bearing in mind that all of this is second nature to the people in office right now, mostly recycled from the Reagan-Bush administration, in fact, from its most reactionary components. During the Reagan years, the policies that the government was carrying out were quite unpopular domestically, which isn't surprising. There was a period of it was a period of relatively slow growth, but also of stagnation or decline for much of the population. The U.S. ended up that period with the highest workload in the world and the lowest wages. That was a welcome development of transcendent importance, the Wall Street Journal editorial said, but the population didn't quite agree with that. In 1984, which is called a Reagan landslide, meant about 30% of the electorate of the voters by a considerable majority, about 3-2, hoped that his legislative program would not be enacted, and the unpopularity continued. At the end of the period, the Reagan-Bush period, in the regular poll of popularity of living ex-presidents, Reagan ranked right at the bottom, just beat out by Nixon, was a little more unpopular, second only to Nixon on unpopularity, even below Ford, who nobody even remembered. Well, how do you hold power when you're carrying out policies that the population opposes? It's only one way anyone's ever thought of, and that's to inspire fear. So it started right off, 1981. Libyan hitmen were wandering the streets of Washington planning to assassinate our leader. Then came Grenada, barely saved in time. Then Nicaragua. Then one thing after a lot of domestic fears stimulated. You'll recall that George Bush won his presidential campaign with a straight race card. A black rapist is going to rape your grandmother unless you vote for me, and that was just enough to get him over the hump. Shortly after that, there was a government media-inspired propaganda campaign about drugs. Within a month, concern over drugs rose in the polls from one of the lowest concerns to the highest concern that anybody had. Drugs are going to destroy us. We've got to be frightened again. And one thing after another. I mean, even welfare mothers, by implication black, driving to welfare offices in their Cadillacs to steal your hard-earned money. That's something you have to be afraid of. There's almost nothing you can't be afraid of. And it can work. It's a very frightened country. It goes way back for all sorts of reasons. There's a long tradition. It's a serious problem, and it's a problem to be addressed by people who want to salvage the rights that have been won over many years of bitter struggle and to go on to a more decent society. These facts about the society and the culture have to be addressed, and they are easily exploited by unscrupulous leaders. We're going to just seen a case. We'll see another coming up in the next election. Well, going back to the grand imperial strategy, there are some precedents in the international arena, not just the domestic one, and it's worth being aware of them. It teaches you something about the spectrum, the planning spectrum, the spectrum of policy, the range of policy options within the elite of policymakers in the United States. So let's go back 40 years when we didn't have the most, now it's the most reactionary government in history, then was maybe the most liberal, Kennedy administration. In 1963, Dean Acheson, who's a respected elder statesman, leading senior advisor to President Kennedy, gave an important address to the American Society of International Law, in which he explained to them that no legal issue arises in the case of a U.S. response to a challenge to its power, position, and prestige. Okay? So if anyone challenges the power, prestige, position, or prestige of the United States, and the U.S. responds, say, by violence, that doesn't raise any legal issue. Notice that that goes well beyond the national security strategy of last September, and this is from the opposite end of the political spectrum. The address was particularly important because of the timing. This was right after the simmering down of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis came very close to a terminal nuclear war. We only learned how close last October. It turned out it was literally one word away from a terminal nuclear war. A Russian submarine commander countermounted an order to shoot off nuclear missiles when the submarines were under attack by U.S. destroyers. And had he not countermanded the order, we wouldn't be discussing the matter. That was immediately after that. This was, you'll recall that the background of that was an international terrorist campaign, a major terrorist campaign, which started right after the Castro took power aimed at what's called now regime change. Pretty familiar phrases. That led to the missile crisis. The terrorism went on through the missile crisis, stopped briefly, was resumed again immediately after, and that's when Acheson gave his speech, talking about, pointing out that, instructing the international lawyers that no legal issue arises when the U.S. responds to a challenge. What was the challenge? Well, we're lucky to be in a very free country, so we know. We have unusual access to government planning documents, more so than any other place, and the number of them recently been released, which bear on this. Turns out that the challenge was what the government called Castro's successful defiance of a policy of the United States going back 150 years, namely the policy that says country states in that region have to be subordinate to U.S. power. And he was defying that. That's a defiance to the power, position, and prestige of the United States, so the reactions are legitimate, even though they had just virtually led to nuclear war. Another threat that Cuba was posing, we read in the documents, is that the threat of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, which might appeal to others in the region who face similar repression, a terrible legacy of repression and poverty and suffering, and that can't be accepted. So that's a clear precedent for the national security strategy from the opposite end of the spectrum. Going back to the reactionary end of the spectrum, during the Reagan years, the legal advisor to the State Department, Judge Abram Sofair, explained publicly, in this case, just like Acheson, publicly, why the United States could not accept the jurisdiction of the World Court in the case brought to the court by Nicaragua, calling on the court to order the United States to terminate its terrorist attack against Nicaragua. The court accepted the case, ruled in favor of Nicaragua, was of course disregarded, and the U.S. immediately escalated the terrorist war with bipartisan support, I should add. The legal advisor explained why we had to reject the court jurisdiction. The reason, he said, is that other nations do not agree with us, and therefore we must reserve to ourselves the right to determine what falls within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States. In this case, a terrorist war against Nicaragua. Well, that passed without comment. That's two ends of the spectrum. Not a great spectrum. However, these two examples, and they're not the only ones, are different from the national security strategy in a number of respects. First of all, they were describing policy. The security strategy declares policy. Secondly, they were doing it within the family, among international lawyers and other elites who know enough to keep quiet about it and not let the public know what their government is up to. So nobody knows. You don't read it in school where you ought to read it. But now it's being proclaimed loud and clear. It's official policy, and you're supposed to hear it and be frightened, and people are frightened. There are other precursors which are worth thinking about. The National Security Council, the highest planning body, was established in 1947, produces regular memoranda on planning. The first memorandum of the National Security Council in 1947 was concerned with Italy. There was an election coming up in Italy. There was great concern that the left and the working class parties were going to win the election. And the first memorandum of the National Security Council called for military support for underground military operations in Italy, along with national mobilization in the United States in the event the communists obtained domination of the Italian government by legal means. That would be unsuccessful defiance. That threat of democracy happened to be forestalled by withholding food from starving people, reinstating the fascist police, other means short of international terrorism, but that was ordered in case it didn't work. This is now hailed as part of our nobility in establishing democracy in the post-war period. There are many similar examples. Even before World War II, similar doctrines were discussed. So in the early days of World War II, before the United States got in the war, was attacked, there were high-level meetings of the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations planning for the post-war world. It was pretty clear the United States was going to be, for the first time in its history, a dominant global power. And their plans called for the United States to hold unquestioned power, acting to ensure limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that interfere with its global designs. The U.S. must follow an integrated policy to achieve military and economic supremacy for the United States, not brooking any challenge. Well, at the time, those ambitions were limited to what was called the non-German world. They assumed that Germany would end up holding part of the world. The rest, the non-German world, was to be organized under U.S. control as what they called a grand area that would include the former British Empire, the Western Hemisphere, of course, and the Far East. After Russia beat back the Nazi armies at Stalingrad, it became fairly clear that Germany was going to be defeated. The plans were extended to include as much of Eurasia as possible, and they were in fact implemented. If you read those plans and you take a look at what happened after the Second World War, they're not surprisingly very similar. Well, there are plenty of precedents, but there has never been a brazen, open declaration of a grand imperial strategy. All of these things were internal. You're not supposed to know about them. Public, but you don't know about them. Well, what are there are a lot of consequences of the imperial grand strategy, and they're well known. One I've mentioned. It's almost certain to lead to proliferation of weapons of mass destruction as a deterrent. That was recognized at once. It increases with every additional step. So last week, Congress dropped the ban on research and development of low-yield nuclear weapons. Low yield means approximately a third of the Hiroshima bomb. That technology is too advanced for others to follow, except maybe for Israel, because it's an offshoot of U.S. power. But other countries aren't going to be able to follow that. However, it was immediately predicted, and plausibly, that would be an incentive for other nuclear states to expand their own offensive capacities. For example, Pakistan or China, which means it'll spread to India, and there'll be a chain reaction, probably on to the major nuclear power in the Middle East, Asia region. A number of analysts have pointed out, and it's again obvious, that the Bush administration is practically pleading with Iran to initiate or accelerate a nuclear weapons program that's going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy in order to justify an invasion, or more likely, I think, subversion, because Iran fails the primary condition for a target that's not defenseless. And that subversion may already be going on. Another consequence is to increase terror as a deterrent and a revenge. And it's a serious threat. No one should joke about it. Well, enhancing serious threats to U.S. security is in fact quite rational within the accepted framework of assumptions. Maybe the framework is lunatic, but the choices within it are quite rational. There just are some higher priorities. So establishing the imperial grand strategy of world domination and restructuring domestic society under the control of unaccountable systems of private power, reducing democracy to empty forms, these are really high priorities. And to achieve them, it's worth facing the threat of massive terror and possible nuclear war. It's not the first time in history that such choices have been made by dedicated leaders. Kind of a miracle we've survived this long, but you can understand the rationality of the policies given the framework. There are other problems. One critical one is the Middle East, the Israel-Palestine problem. Continuing turmoil there threatens U.S. control of the world's major energy resources, and something has to be done about that. Well, what's supposed to be done, we read about. We're supposed to stare in awe at the president's vision of a Palestinian state. You've noticed, I'm sure, that there's a journalistic convention by now that whenever you mention George Bush, you have to mention his vision of something or other. The vision is never described. We don't know what it is, but it's noble by definition. In this case, his vision of a Palestinian state, somewhere, some authority, nobody knows. That's a wonderful vision. You have to forget a few facts when you describe his vision of a Palestinian state. Namely, there's been an international consensus for almost 30 years on establishing a Palestinian state in the territories occupied by Israel. It's also supported by 2/3 of the American public now, meaning a two-state settlement on the international border pre-June 67 with some mutual adjustments, a one-to-one land swap or something like that. For almost 30 years, that's been blocked unilaterally by the United States. I won't run through it, but it continues right through the Clinton-Barack years. So during the Clinton-Barack years, the 1990s, there was a huge program of building settlements and infrastructure with the clear design of splitting the West Bank into 4 cantons, north, central, south, all separated from East Jerusalem, a little bit of East Jerusalem, the center of Palestinian cultural and commercial life, which is to be virtually separated. Technically there's some passages, but very hard to maneuver, kind of a 4 Bantustan settlement, and that's continuing. The Camp David proposals, year 2000, the Clinton-Barack proposals, they were lauded profusely in the press, magnanimous, wonderful, and so on. There's a very easy way to evaluate the praise, namely have a look at the map that was proposed. Well, that's a little difficult. Apparently not a single map was published anywhere in the U.S. press, at least nobody can find one. It's not that the maps were unavailable. They were published in Israel, they were published in Europe, they were published in the standard scholarly sources and the dissident literature, but no map was available for people to determine the magnanimity of the offer, and there's a plausible reason for that. As soon as you looked at the map, you saw exactly what I described. 4 cantons mix. South Africa's Bantustan programs 40 years ago looked pretty good. And Sharon and Bush in the next phase are just extending that. While the vision is being pronounced, the bulldozers are happily at work as well. And they're creating the facts on the ground, which will tell you what the vision is. There's a separation wall being built from the north. It's already surrounded and virtually destroyed the Palestinian town of Qalqilia. It was announced a couple of weeks ago that south of that it's going to extend to the east, including Ariel and Emmanuel, 2 settlements to the east. That establishes within the separation wall, meaning on the Israeli side, one of the 2 Clinton-Barack salients, which were to split the West Bank in 3, establishes the northern of the 2 salients. Nobody doubts that the bigger and more important salient from Jerusalem way over to the east, almost to Jericho, will also be included. That includes the town of Ma'ale Adumim, which was built primarily under Clinton and Barack in order to bisect partition the West Bank. The territories that are assigned to the settlements go far beyond the actual settled parts, allowing for expansion without any change in the settlement boundaries. Estimates by Israeli analysts are that includes approximately 50% of the West Bank. And Sharon understands it perfectly well. A lot of talk about how he made this diplomatic move of accepting the roadmap, but less talk about what he told his cabinet. He told them, don't worry about it. about settlement. He said, there is no restriction here, and you can build for your children and grandchildren, and I hope for your great-grandchildren as well. And that's very reasonable, given the way the facts on the ground are being established. Quite apart from the vision and the facts on the ground, there's also a record of actions which you can look at. So the Bush administration's first major act with regard to Israel-Palestine at the United Nations in 2001, December, was to veto the dispatch of international monitors in an effort to reduce the level of violence in the territories. They want the violence to continue because they know it's mostly Israeli violence to suppress the Palestinians. Just a week before that, the Bush administration boycotted and therefore undermined a meeting of the high contracting parties of the Geneva Convention. That's just about everybody, including the whole European Union, which once again produced a harsh condemnation of illegal actions, including just about everything that's going on there, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. All of this, incidentally, is silenced. You don't read anything about it. Last December, at the next meeting of the UN, the U.S. took a position which, if it's taken seriously, is extremely significant. Every year, the United Nations has ratified a 1968 Security Council resolution calling on Israel to terminate it and withdraw from its effective annexation of Jerusalem, expansion and annexation of Jerusalem. This year, last December, for the first time, the United States voted against that. To be precise, it voted against a resolution reaffirming it, meaning voted essentially in favor of the annexation. If that's meant seriously, that's extremely significant. It ends any possibility of any settlement. Jerusalem is now a big area extending into the West Bank. Shortly after that, in February, the president made what the press described as his most significant statement on the Israel-Arab issue. Statements published in the press, mostly boilerplate, visions and so on, but it did have one significant statement in it. It said that settlement can continue until the president decides that sufficient progress has been made in the peace process. That's another shift in policy. Up until now, at least rhetorically, these settlement programs have been opposed, even though they're funded by the United States and protected by the United States. But now they're not even rhetorically opposed. So we go on. These huge U.S.-supplied bulldozers are working away, building the facts that are going to eliminate any possibility of any meaningful vision while solemn debate goes on about the roadmap. Well, just another word, and I won't go into it, but there are other problems. The world is not that easy to run. There are two major areas of the world which could go their own way. These are long-standing. One of them, Europe, is a long-standing problem. 30 years ago was what was called the Year of Europe, and Henry Kissinger then made a famous address called the Year of Europe Address, in which he instructed the Europeans that they have what he called regional responsibilities, which they are to carry out within the overall framework of order managed by the United States. But don't forget your limits. A lot of the manufactured hatred about France and Germany has to do with they are the heartland of the European economy and of its political strength, and therefore the threat that they might move towards some kind of independent course remains very significant. By now there are similar problems in Asia. Northeast Asia is the most dynamic economic region in the world, the fastest growing. Its gross domestic product is considerably larger than the United States. It has a half of the financial reserves of the world. It's an integrated region. It has resources, developing industrial countries, leading ones that need the resources. integrated pipelines going from, say, Siberia to South Korea, quote a recent U.S. study, pipelines could enhance regional stability and provide cheap alternatives to oil imported from the Middle East, where the United States maintains control. That's quite significant. One of the major reasons to control the Middle East oil reserves has been to maintain what George Kennan 50 years ago called veto power over other countries. If they forget that they have only regional responsibilities, we can strangle them. But if the integrated region of Northeast Asia actually moves towards independence, as it could, that veto power could be lost. The North Korean issue is very much entangled in this. Well, without going on, there are plenty of ominous developments in world affairs. The United States, of course, plays a leading role. It is far and away the most important military power and a huge economy. And for us, that's a very lucky thing. In much of the world, people can't really do very much. In large parts of the world, they live under such repression that they can mostly watch and fear. But we are uniquely privileged, and we can determine the course of future events very substantially. It's not necessary to say that the stakes are very high. It's no exaggeration to say that by this point they literally reach to survival of the species. Okay, go ahead.
Professor, you mentioned very early on that you thought that it was not pragmatically in the United States' interest to pursue unilateral imperialist policy, and I think that would be a very persuasive argument to most middle-of-the-road people, but I want to challenge you on that, to push that, because I heard you say that, I heard you give a number of possible reasons why that was not in our interest, but why couldn't we be like Rome and just by pure force enforce our will on everyone? So what if there's more terrorism? It helps people keep control of our own population, and that's what the Romans did. We grab the resources of the world. Why does that not work? So what if there's some more nuclear weapons in the world? We have better ones and more technologically sophisticated ones. Why can't we just shove it down everyone's throat and rule the world for a few hundred years like the Romans did?
Well, first of all, just to be clear, I wasn't giving my opinion. I was quoting mainstream foreign policy elite positions. This quote happened to be from Foreign Affairs, but there's many others. One rather striking thing about the national security strategy and the war in Iraq was that it aroused enormous elite opposition, like nothing else ever before, not just among foreign policy elites or overseas, but even in the business world. So at the World Economic Forum, which is, the guys who own the world, basically, when Colin Powell came to present the U.S. position on Iraq there, he was practically shouted down. He could hardly talk. There's a lot of concern about this. But your point, I don't disagree with it. In fact, I said something about it at the end. Within the framework of assumptions that they adopt, it is perfectly rational to face increased terror, increased proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, likely destruction of the species. It's perfectly rational to accept those threats because there's a higher priority. Namely, dominating the world, reconstructing domestic U.S. society, disciplining the population. The framework of assumptions is insane. But within the framework, it's a rational choice. And it's been followed by others. It's not just Rome. There are plenty of countries that, if you take a look at the history of war, you'll find that quite often whoever initiated the war ends up getting devastated. Okay? But leaders are willing to take the risk because they had higher goals. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a perfectly good example. It came just within a hair of destroying human life. But immediately afterwards, the Kennedy administration continued the terrorist campaign, and Acheson gave the speech that I described. In fact, if you really want a striking example, go back 50 years. The United States was just overwhelmingly powerful, say around 1950. It had a position of security without any parallel in history, controlled the whole hemisphere, controlled the oceans, controlled the other sides of the oceans. There was one potential threat to U.S. security, at that time only potential. That was intercontinental ballistic missiles with thermonuclear warheads. How could you prevent that? Chances are you could have prevented it by treaty. The Russians were so far behind that they would have very likely agreed to a treaty to prevent the development of the weapons that were the only possible threat to the United States, and a serious one. Well, was there any discussion of this? There is a standard history of the arms race by McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, who had rich access to classified materials and so on. And he mentions that he can't find any discussion of it, any discussion of the option of pursuing a treaty that might have succeeded and might have protected the United States from the only potential threat to its existence. Well, yeah, history shows many such examples, and this is another one.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, Professor Chomsky, I wanted to know exactly when you made the leap from linguist to activist, or if there ever was a leap, and what position in world dominance does the continent of Africa play, or is the continent of my ancestors basically a nebulous dumping ground of war, exploitation, and colonization?
I never made the leap. I started as a child as a political activist, got to linguistics later, actually through political connections. On Africa, your word exploitation is very much the point. At the end of the Second World War, right at the time of a little after the pronouncement of the Grand Area Strategy that I was describing, that was around 1941, 42. A couple of years later, the U.S. was in the world dominant position that was anticipated, and after that, U.S. planners laid out very sophisticated, careful strategies as to how to run the world. The head of the State Department policy planning staff, George Kennan, who is considered way at the dovish end. In fact, he was kicked out later because he was considered too soft-hearted for this cold world. He did, as head of the policy planning staff, laid out, what was called the function of every region of the world. So the function of Southeast Asia was to provide resources and raw materials for the former imperial powers to allow them to reconstruct, and it was to be what he called an empire toward the south for Japan. Japan was to be given its new order, the new order it had fought to establish, but now under U.S. rule, so it didn't matter. And he went through region after region, and he did get to Africa. And there's a section on Africa in which he says that the U.S. has no particular interest in Africa, so we should therefore turn it over to the Europeans to exploit. It's his term, which you correctly picked up. We should turn it over to the Europeans to exploit for their own reconstruction. Okay, well, you look at the history of relations between Europe and Africa, some other idea might have come to mind, but that was never considered. So yeah, Africa was turned over to the Europeans to exploit. The U.S. didn't care that much. I mean, it did care enough in the subsequent, it did leave Africa mostly to the European initiatives. It cared enough to get involved in overthrowing Lumumba and a couple other things, but mostly that was part of Europe's regional responsibilities. So France is to ensure that vicious terrorist states rule former French Africa, West Africa, to protect oil interests and so on, and Britain's to control its regions and so on. The U.S. kind of keeps an eye on it, but it hasn't changed that much. That's why Nobody knows how many because you don't bother counting when the region doesn't matter, but undoubtedly millions of people have been killed just in the last few years in the fighting in the Congo. But, who cares?
Yeah, there's a interview on buzzflash.com with one of the authors of Bush's Brain about Karl Rove, and they make the point that, they can land on the Abraham Lincoln and with the mission accomplished in the background, and people will see that image, and it was designed for people to see with the sound off, that they just see the image and even if all the details aren't, collaborating it. So I was just wondering, how can we fight the public relations firms and Karl Rove with these images if all the facts are out there? How do we get it out there more?
That's what organizers are for, and what activists are for. You could ask, how could we ever get rid of slavery? The slave owners were so powerful, nobody was opposing them. The struggle to get rid of slavery didn't take one demonstration. Went on for years and years, and finally ended up with a violent war. Finally slavery was overcome. It was not easy. Take, say, women's rights. Women's rights were discussed 2 centuries ago. The first time they really made it to the agenda of, implementation was in the 1960s. Actually, the 1970s. It wasn't until it was the current movement really developed after the 60s. In fact, in part because of extreme sexism within the movements of the 60s, which led to a lot of things. But it was a long, hard struggle, and so is everything else. And the same is true here. Don't forget that the Karl Roves and the corporate executives and so on, they're basically Marxists. They are very consciously fighting a bitter class war. And if you read their internal literature, they say it. They're concerned about the rising political power of the masses and the hazards this poses and so on and so forth. It's kind of vulgar Marxist rhetoric, just values inverted. But it's a constant class war, and they're always fighting it naturally. They own most of the world, and they care about it. And one of the techniques is to convert elections into public relations shows. Actually, the roots of that go back to the Kennedy administration. That was just at the time when television was coming along. And the Kennedy administration understood how they could use this new device effectively as a political tool. And it continued over the years. This administration is extreme. The resort to public relations extravaganzas is so transparent that you just have to laugh at it. Every person in the administration comes straight out of central casting, and the public is aware of it. So for organizers and activists, it's not much of a door to push. For example, right before the last election, 2000 election, there are careful studies of public attitudes, and they're informative. Harvard University has what they call a vanishing voter project, Kennedy School of Government, which studies people's attitudes towards elections. Right before the last election, so no Florida, no Supreme Court, nothing like that. About 75% of the population regarded it as a charade, didn't care about it. They thought it's it's only something going on with rich contributors and the public relations industry, which they said is simply crafting candidates to say things that'll maybe make you like them, but being very careful to make sure that you don't know where they stand on issues. And most people couldn't figure out where the candidates stand on issues. And if you bothered listening to the debates, you can see why. They were carefully trained so that you couldn't figure it out, because people are not supposed to vote on issues. They're supposed to vote for the character who's coming out of central casting. They're supposed to vote on what are called qualities, character, that sort of thing, but not issues. It's too dangerous because the public disagrees with elite opinion on over a wide range of issues. So issues have to be kept out of the elections. Public is aware of it. They're aware of the public relations extravaganza. That's an open door for people who want to do something about it. But, you know, the changes aren't going to happen by themselves anymore than with any other issue. It's just a lot easier now than it used to be. But still takes hard, dedicated, day-to-day work. Nothing comes easily. Yeah, it's a case in point. Go ahead. I just want to...
Professor Chomsky, I quoted Z Magazine, May 93. You mentioned the U.S. always diminished the Iraqi democratic opposition with disdain, including the most conservative element, such as London-based banker Ahmad Chalabi. Again, in 98, you mentioned that opposition alternative to the war is Chalabi. Even after Chalabi went to the Iraq with the U.S. troop, you also mentioned that the U.S.-backed opposition demands that the UN play a vital role in post-war Iraq and reconstruction, reject U.S. control of construction of the government. Are you still believe that Chalabi is a democratic alternative to the regime? Thank you.
That's for the term that was used, and I kept to it. In the so-called democratic opposition, there were very serious people. The U.S., if the quotes that you're giving are from the first tenure of the current administration, at the time of Saddam Hussein's major crimes, like Halabja and Anfal and the gassing the Kurds, all that stuff, the U.S. supported him so strongly that the State Department ordered breaking all contacts between the U.S. government and what was called the Democratic Opposition. And that continued. So in March 1991, after the war was over, that ban on contacts with opposition figures, very conservative ones, like bankers, for example, in Iraq, that continued. And it continued through most of the period. It changed in the 80s as the U.S. changed policy and began to look for a coup in Iraq. They didn't want an uprising, but they did want a coup if that was possible, which would put power back in the hands of people they could control. And at that point, the connections with some of these people changed. After the current invasion, the split appeared again. The quote that I gave is an example of that. Yes, these conservative opposition leaders, whatever you think about them, are joining everybody else in bitterly complaining over the fact that the U.S. will not allow even them to have a role in running Iraq, let alone the general population. As to evaluation of them, that's a different matter. There are different members of them, and I'd make different judgments.
Last spring, I was with the International Solidarity Movement in Bet Sahur near Bethlehem, and heard the story that years before, the whole village of Bet Sahur refused to pay taxes to the Israeli government, refusing to be cooperating with their own repression. And this is my question for all of us. Stop U.S. tax-funded aid to Israel. I'm saying we should stop paying any taxes to the United States government because if we don't, at some point, I think, we are going to all be held culpable under Nuremberg. We are all guilty of war crimes against our brothers and sisters, and your ominous ending that we're at the end time, the destruction of all life on earth. Isn't it the moment to say we will all join together and refuse to pay any more money to this mad murderer who lives at the White House and the Pentagon? Thank you.
Actually, I'm sympathetic to the idea. Back in 1965, I, along with a friend, tried to organize a national tax resistance campaign, refusal to pay taxes, and we kept at it for quite a few years. So I don't have any objection to the tactic, but it's a tactic. It should be understood that it's a tactic. It is not a strategy to overturn the government. And when you think about tactics, you have to ask about their consequences. Are they going to work? Aren't they going to work? And so on. In the case of Beit Sahur, that was during the first Intifada, And it was one of the many examples of completely nonviolent resistance. But it was just crushed by violence. Israel crushed it very brutally, and that means the U.S. crushed it because it's with U.S. support that it was done. So, yes, they tried it, and they were smashed. Pardon? How did it happen?
How did they smash it?
Oh, they went in and broke people's bones and beat them up, followed Yitzhak Rabin's orders to break their bones and to crush them and make sure they don't raise their heads and so on. If you want to observe what happened, and I happened to be there for a while during the first Intifada, but which was mostly nonviolent, or, throwing stones sometimes, and the response was extremely brutal. Including the Doves. The general in charge was Amram Mitzna, who's now the leader of the Doves. Rabin himself was particularly brutal. In fact, at the end of the Intifada, it was kind of coming to an end in 1989, when the U.S. was finally driven into a corner. It was making itself ridiculous by pretending it didn't hear that the PLO was offering negotiations. It was becoming object of international ridicule. George Schultz, Secretary of State, finally agreed to have discussions with the PLO, but they were completely meaningless. That was made clear. And he actually had a meeting with Peace Now leaders in Israel, reported in the Israeli press, in which he told them, don't worry about these negotiations with the PLO. They are just a device to enable us to crush the Intifada by force. And they will be, to have a year or more to crush it by force, and they will be crushed, he said. That's what happens. There's a limit to what people can sustain in the way of violence and repression when they don't have any support. So it was a tactic. It was a not perfect, completely nonviolent, of course, middle-class community, and it was crushed in the standard way. Is it a proper tactic for us? Well, here you have to just ask, what are the consequences? Is it going to work? Personally, I dropped out of it around 1975 because it was becoming meaningless. It just became a matter of my sending impassioned letters to the IRS and some computer sending back equally impassioned letter and taking away the taxes at the source and so on. I mean, they did go after people kind of randomly, but it was very unclear what they were doing. And it just didn't seem to be an effective way of educating and organizing people. And that's what you have to ask yourself now. Is it an effective way? But it is a tactic. It is not in itself, it's not a way of changing policy. It's a way of getting people to face things. So personally, I rather doubt that that's the useful tactic for today. Incidentally, as far as funding Israel, it's worth bearing in mind something that the press won't report. A large majority of the main study of institution that studies public opinion in the United States on international affairs happens to be at the University of Maryland. It's I forget what it's called, Institute of Public something. Very good. They do extremely good work. About a year ago, they did a study of attitudes of the population in the United States toward the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it was extremely interesting. I don't think there was ever a mention of it in the press. But one of the questions they asked had to do with funding. And a considerable majority of the population, I think it was about 2/3, held that the United States should refuse any funding to either of the adversaries, Israel or the Palestinians, which refuses to enter into meaningful negotiations. Now, people didn't know, because they don't know the facts, that meant cut off funding to Israel totally, because they were the one who was refusing to enter negotiations. They also said that if the similar majority, roughly 2-1, held that if both parties agree to negotiations, the U.S. should equalize funding to them. I mean, that's such a radical change from policy that you can't even discuss it. But it's another one of those open doors as far as organizing and activism is concerned. You've already got the majority of the public on your side. I think the problem is to get them to get some awareness of what the reality of the situation is and what the U.S. role is. I mentioned before, it didn't happen to be their poll, but another poll showed that approximately 2/3 of the population is in favor of what's nowadays called the Saudi plan, which is just, the latest version of the plan since the mid-'70s for a two-state settlement. That's about roughly the same percentage of the population wanted the U.S. to become.
But also try to be quiet because we got 2 more questions.
Top in the center. First of all, I'd like to say, Professor Chomsky, you're my guru, and thanks for being a voice in the midst of this madness. The question I'd like to ask is this. It's in regards to the question of ethics. Another philosopher who's had a profound effect on me is Camus. And in Camus' book, The Rebel, he talks about the fact that we must look at each individual as only having one existence, one life, and this is their only show on earth. And if the human could understand the implications of taking the life of another human, which is so final, so infinite, and taking their existence, this could be the basis for profound social justice, a profound way of thinking, a profound basis for ethics. My question to you is, do you feel in this new millennia that existentialism has a philosophical basis for profoundly offering us a basis for a new ethics?
Personally, I didn't think it then, and I don't think it now. But, you know, you have to make your own judgment. I mean, I'm telling you my judgment. On the quote that you gave from Camus, that's another one of those open doors, in my opinion. I think almost everyone would agree with that. The problem is to get people to understand how they are acting in such a way as to undermine that commitment. And that's a matter, always comes back to the same thing, of serious, hard educational and organizational activities. I don't really think you have to convince people that there's something horrible about taking a human life. But what you, take, say, Iraq again, what you have to convince them of is that you are not protecting yourself from imminent destruction when you and from the increase in, from another terrorist atrocity when you bomb Iraq. That's not what you're doing. If people think, yes, that's what we are doing, then on the very principle you mentioned, they'll support the action, just as Camus himself supported repression in Algeria.
Yes. Professor, thank you very much. Your insights are appreciated and sorely needed. I think we all noticed that shortly after the war in Iraq, there were many contracts being awarded to international corporations, contrary to popular belief, not just from the United States and United Kingdom. Is it reasonable to surmise that the war in Iraq opened up Iraq's borders to foreign influence in the form of corporate reconstruction campaigns? And if so, what influence will these foreign elements have on the new Iraq politically?
Well, I think if you want to get a picture of what the new Iraq is going to be politically, I'd recommend my favorite newspaper, the New York Times, which had, on I think May 7th, had you can't get it on the internet edition, but in the print edition, if you can find it, they published what was called an organization chart for the post-war civil administration in Iraq. Okay, and it was pretty straightforward. I mean, the organization chart, it's one of these things with boxes and lines and all that stuff. It had, this is from memory, I might not be exactly right. I think it had 16 boxes. With at the top was Paul Bremer, answering to the Pentagon, and then lines down to other generals and a couple of diplomats and so on. And each of those boxes had in bold face the name of the individual and a description of the person's responsibilities. Okay, that was 16 boxes. If you take a look at the chart, at the very bottom, kind of hidden down there, was a little box about a third the size of any of the others, no bold face, no names, no assignments. That was called Iraqi advisors. Okay. Yeah, that's the post-war civil administration, and it says it pretty straight. They will allow in some other corporations. You don't want to make it look like, for one thing, the United States wants others to take over the costs, so you're going to have to give them a few crumbs. But the idea will be that I'm convinced that the United States is going to run it. It's going to continue a long-standing policy of ensuring that the people of Iraq don't run it.